All right. And I am going to continue with the topic that we started last week. I'll say a little bit about some of the news this week very briefly. Um, and I'm changing ever so slightly the title to bring a little bit more in. Why and how 21st century capitalism undermines American democracy, or why the economy remains a liability for Harris despite signs that it's stronger than it's been for a quarter century. And we'll get into, I'm actually going to provide a little bit more contemporary data than I did last week. And if you're an economist looking at the macroeconomic data, I think you look at this and you say to yourself, this is the best economy the United States has had in 35 years. If you're a sociologist or a political scientist and you're looking at what people think about this economy, you see that 75% of people believe this economy is fair or poor, right? And so there's some important divergence between what the economy seems to be doing in the way that we measure it, its leading indicators, as economists say, and what those indicators are missing, which is the lived experience of being in the economy. And I will add, right, the subtitle to the lecture, right, and it would be a liability for Trump if he wins. And here I'm assuming two things. The first, well, maybe three things. The very first is that there's a reasonable chance that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States, and with just a few weeks until the election, if that's a depressing and alarming thing to hear, to say the least. All I can say is there are 2.5 weeks left. We can do what we can in those 2.5 weeks. If you really don't want Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States, please note that it looks like there's as good a chance that he will as he won't, with voting starting in most of the states in the U.S. right now. So just an indication that your time for action is limited. But the second thing I would say is that I don't think that any of Trump's policies will do anything to address what is causing economic duress in the 21st century. As a matter of fact, I think it is quite likely that if he actually does what he says he's going to do, which is on the one hand to deport millions or tens of millions of Americans, it is going to dramatically increase the price and disrupt the provision of goods and services in an economy in which the vast majority of those people are employed and employed in critical sectors, right? We've stopped calling them essential workers, but they are providing services that are essential to all of us at a cost that, frankly, replacing them with the native born would require increasing wages dramatically. And of course, those costs will be passed on. So the first big plank of Trump's economic plan, deport the people competing with the native born, is going to be very bad for the native born. The second big plank, I think we've talked more about tariffs, and the idea that if he really does double the tariffs on Chinese goods, if he really does increase tariffs on all other kinds of countries that don't have the problematic trade relations with the United States that China does in certain regards. The Wall Street Journal did a long analysis of this about 4 days ago. It's not just that it's going to vastly increase the cost of goods as much as $4,000 per person per year in the United States, because we are so dependent on supply chains coming from other countries, whether that's our fruit and vegetables coming from all over the world, or the computers and phones that we're talking to each other on right now having components that are made in 50 countries. In a very different context, I showed you the structure of the Amazon supply chain. I think that's 3 years ago. Maybe it's a distant memory. But, right, the idea that the average person who shops on Amazon over the course of a year buys things that have components made in 100 different countries. And so, if, as is all but certain would happen, Trump raised walls of tariff barrier for importation to the largest economy in the world, the economy that is most integrated and integral to the global economy, not only will the price of our goods go up, but it's quite likely that global trade war will break out and that the partial disintegration of the global economy that is already occurring and creating some inflation, creating some disruption, mainly that seems to have worked its way through the supply chains over the last 3 or 4 years, that those kinds of problems that we associate with the pandemic will come back with a vengeance, right? So in both of those respects, right, Trump's plans will actually make things worse. But let's assume I'm wrong about all that. Let's assume alternatively that that's just all bluster for the campaign trail. And when Donald Trump gets into the presidency, he listens to his economic advisors and they say, don't do that. That's a catastrophe. And he doesn't. I still think the economy is a problem for Donald Trump, that the economy is a problem for the president, for the incumbent, for the foreseeable future in the United States. And I want to say more about that today. But let me just point out very quickly, and I'll get into the details. But the primary reason that the economy is a problem is that we have an affordability crisis. And it is a long, slow developing affordability crisis. When we talk about housing costs, when we talk about healthcare costs, when we talk about education, especially higher education costs, when we talk about childcare costs, when we talk about something that will hit near to home, elder care costs. These costs, in ways that I'll show you, have been increasing for 30 or 40 years faster than the overall cost of inflation. And if you know a little bit about compounding interest rates, right, those, right, gradual increases over time amount to much more substantial erosions of purchasing power in the 30th or the 40th year than they did in the first couple decades, that these gradual increases in costs of core goods did. And let us then note housing, healthcare, I think very clear. Higher education, childcare, maybe a little bit more complicated, but still quite similar. Elder care, I think, right, part of the question here is as we deal with the lifespan revolution, as we deal with populations that are growing older, do the social insurance or security programs of the middle of the 20th century work anymore in the 21st century? All that put together is to say these are public policy issues, right? And we know, right? And some of the data I've been looking at, it's astounding to see there were more housing starts in America in 1959 than there were in 2019, right? And the population is double what it was in 2019 as opposed to 1959, but we were building more houses for half the population in the middle of the 20th century than we were building at the end of the second decade of the 21st century. We know that we spend 17% of our GDP on healthcare, double the average for the OECD, for the other developed economies of the world, and that the care that we get, the outcomes that we get, are worse than those of the rest of the world, right? So these are clearly public policy problems. And so one thing I would say, if Trump wins, he doesn't have the policies that are required to solve the problems. But if Harris wins, I don't think there's a snowflake's chance in hell that she will be able to pass the legislation that addresses the problems. Don't get me wrong, I do think that there's a possibility that the Democrats will have a narrow majority in both houses of Congress. I think it's much more likely that the Democrats will win the House and lose the Senate. But having said that, if they miraculously pull off the Senate, then it's still the case that it's going to be incredibly difficult to legislate. And many of these problems require systematic legislative reform. And Democrat, Republican, in a period of partisan paralysis, we really don't want to work with each other across party lines in an era of rough partisan parity, where control of the House and the Senate keep going back and forth, and they're always a razor's edge, the majority. We're just not going to be able to legislate our way out of these problems, right? And so this is an issue where, to right complete the circle now, the economic problems have political solutions. The economic stress that the economic problems are generating are paralyzing our politics. Therefore, we're not going to solve these problems in the present circumstances. They're going to continue to get worse. And to the extent that these problems are polarizing us, to the extent that they are therefore making it very difficult to legislate, given the constitutional structure of the United States, which makes it, generally speaking, very hard to legislate unless you have a supermajority or a lot of cross-party cooperation, these problems are not going to be solved. They're going to get worse, and it's going to be a problem for whoever the incumbent president is for the foreseeable future. All right, so I've been trying to find art that captures or at least expresses core ideas that I'm interested in sharing with you. Today I have this wonderful painting by Van Gogh, Van Gogh, if you prefer, The Potato Eaters. And it's one of his more famous paintings. There are a few different versions of this, but he spent a lot of time working this image. And right, as I did last week with Degas, I'm trying to, in a sense, suggest that when we think about the economy, we go beneath the superficial information that economic indicators provide. Yes, inflation is down, wage growth is up, and unemployment is at a good level, and the economy and the stock market are growing nicely. But what does that say about the lived experience of average Americans, and in particular about the more vulnerable Americans? 50% of the population, I would suggest, a lot of literature is suggesting, is relatively vulnerable, is relatively precarious. And this is a scene that I think is quite interesting viewed from that vantage. And so you see two things in this scene. This is a scene of people who appear to have nothing but potatoes and tea to eat and drink. And I believe that is meant to communicate that they are experiencing economic hardship. Perhaps this is their lot in life. Perhaps there's some kind of famine or economic downturn that is producing a particular moment of hardship. They are doing their best, if you will, to make a meal out of it, right? They don't look happy, but they also don't look deeply distraught. And so I do think if you look right that they seem to be wearing head coverings, most of them. I think there's a sense of formality to even a simple, humble gathering. They're doing their best to make the best out of what they have. And I do think that there's a tendency for all of us to do that. And I think one of the questions is, in a sense, how long can you do that for before it starts to become difficult to bear or to tolerate? And I don't think this image gives us the answer to that question. But one of the things I want to suggest today is, if I'm correct, that an affordability crisis has been building in the American economy for the last 40 or 50 years. That if, in a sense, the inflation of the last few years has made the affordability crisis much more salient, in part by driving up the cost of some of the goods that had stayed relatively low thanks to globalization or immigrant labor or other factors. And now those goods start coming up, we really all of a sudden feel the pinch. How long have we been eating potatoes for, right? How long have we been trying to compensate for this? I didn't mean to advance the slide, but I might as well now. That's one of the big themes of today's classes, is we've got to think about the economy in those terms. I wanted to spend a minute sharing what I think of as the most important news of the week with you. And the news, as I'm sure you're familiar with, is that Israel has confirmed that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, was killed probably Wednesday, though Thursday is the day the news really broke, the day they were able to confirm it. And that as a result of that, on the one hand, Israel has accomplished one of its core objectives in invading Gaza. That is to say, eliminating the person who ordered the attacks of October 7th. And I'll be as clear as possible. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. Do you view Hamas primarily as a terrorist organization, a proxy for Iran? Do you also view it perhaps as a political party and a group that provides some services in Gaza? I'll be as clear as possible. I think the majority of Gazans don't like Hamas, don't like Sinwar. I think it's difficult, obviously, to get reliable, good polling data out of a place that is being dominated by a single party that is highly authoritarian and operating essentially as a militia whose primary purpose is to harass and threaten its neighbors. And to be as clear, right, Sinwar really moved Hamas in a much more militant, much more terroristic direction. And whether you're talking about it from a Palestinian perspective or an Israeli Jewish perspective, I think probably the majority of Palestinians are happy to see Sinwar gone, would prefer to have a different kind of leadership. And obviously, the majority of Israeli Jews, probably the vast majority of them, are happy to see Sinwar gone. He was a murderer, a butcher, a man who ordered terrorist attacks that had targeted children and women and used, probably, as far as we can tell, sexual violence, and then who built, right, his military infrastructure underneath schools, hospitals, apartment building, mosques, in order to force Israel, or tempt Israel at least, to attack in ways that would maximize civilian casualties in order to attack the organization that had attacked them. In all those respects, right? Someone who we are probably better off not having on the scene. Having said all of that, let me also then add, does this make it more likely that there will be peace in the Gaza Strip, in Israel? And I'm not sure. Obviously, if you're seeing the news this morning, you're seeing that Biden has really resumed his big push to try to get a ceasefire in Gaza. And he also obviously is recognizing this is now either a two-front war or there are two wars, but there's the campaign, the ground invasion of Lebanon as well, going after Hezbollah. And I have to say, pessimistic about the idea that Biden's push will be more efficacious in October, November of 2024, when on the one hand he's a lame duck president, when uh, additionally there's a reasonably good prospect that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States and will be much more willing to support a much more militaristic response from Israel. Not that the United States hasn't supported Israeli military operations quite robustly for the last year plus. And we see some of this with the way in which Sinwar was hunted. It turns out the United States was very much involved in providing material and intelligence support to Israel. But I think the fundamental question in asking the question, have the prospects for peace gone up? It's not just Biden by himself is now a lame duck president who may be succeeded by someone who will fundamentally change the calculus for Netanyahu, who is clearly in the driver's seat in this situation. It's also, right, do the parties on the ground want peace? And it's far from clear to me that the allies of Netanyahu, the far right parties in his coalition, have any desire for peace. I think they see themselves as slowly but surely reducing the Palestinian population in Gaza, maybe also in the West Bank, slowly but surely then pushing out a population that, if demographic trends continued, would quickly outnumber the Jews in Israel, that presented, therefore, fundamental political puzzle for Israel, which claims to be both a Jewish state and a democracy. How do you have a democracy in which you maintain a Jewish majority when a growing portion of the population in your territory isn't Jewish? But also, right, that presents a fundamental security threat to Israel, right? If at least some of the Palestinians do not recognize the right for the Israeli state to exist and have, every time they've been given the opportunity, launched terrorist attacks, very often, as terrorist attacks do, targeting civilians, maximizing fear in your society, you can understand, I think, why those parties are trying to push out the Palestinian population from the West Bank, from Gaza. It solves an otherwise insoluble problem, but the cost is, right, tens of thousands of civilian deaths, over 10,000 child deaths, vast war crimes and human rights abuses, and I think it's only appropriate to call this genocide. And so, having said all of that, right, those parties are hoping to continue this campaign to what they see as its logical conclusion, and Benjamin Netanyahu cannot rule without them. And so I think from the Jewish perspective, from the Israeli perspective, there's less likelihood now that there's going to be a substantial constituency for peace. Netanyahu is going to benefit from having, in the course of a month, eliminated the leaders of two of the most reviled organizations in Israeli society. Both Hamas and Hezbollah have lost their leadership, have been decapitated. It seems finally that perhaps his strategy is actually paying off in certain regards. And then whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas, the idea that in the crucible of conflict, these organizations that have seen their leadership removed will be able to reorganize, and in particular, that moderates might rise and who might therefore pursue peace in these negotiations. I think, again, the likelihood is very slender. I think the only hope here would be if the Israeli public, or a large portion of it, says, look, we've accomplished what we set out to accomplish. Look, the United States is threatening to no longer arm us unless we open humanitarian corridors and get food and eliminate the famine, which is currently plaguing so much of northern Gaza, so much of Gaza as a whole. We are losing our stature, our credibility internationally, and it's time to be done with this. It's time to bring the hostages home. That's, I think, the only prospect there is, and I honestly don't think it's a good prospect. To the election and onwards to more, I think, sobering news. In the Silver Bulletin, which, as you know, I tend to follow, Trump has again overtook Harris, not by any substantial amount. And in a sense, I don't think you should put much stock in that. It's not like Harris was substantially ahead last week and collapsed. This is just an incredibly tight race. It's a razor's edge, and whichever model you look at may give you slightly different results. The betting markets favor Trump at this point. Sometimes they're more accurate, sometimes they're more prone to manipulation or to some forms of influence that are probably not as sensitive to what's actually happening on the ground. But it is absolutely clear that this is a dead heat race. And that's really what I want to try to focus on for the remainder of the time today, and to go back then to thinking about economics to try to explain this. And so I will start with an explanation. And like I said, I spoke with you, if you remember, last week at some length about Karly Polanyi, the great Hungarian, Austrian economic anthropologist, the author of The Great Transformation. We're going to get back to that. But before I do that, I want to talk about an explanation I've talked with you about before, that in a sense I want to diminish its significance. And this is what's sometimes called the vibe economy. That the economy is doing fine. It's just that the way in which we get our information about the economy is so partisan and so slanted or tilted by its partisan lens that we don't believe our lived experience, and instead we end up thinking the economy is better or worse than it is. And there is some clear evidence that this happens, right? This is the Republicans cheer louder and boo harder because they inhabit a more partisan and exaggerated media environment than Democrats do. The evidence is quite clear that Republican partisan amplification of consumer sentiment is roughly 3 times as powerful as Democrats is, right? And that is something that we can't diminish, right? There's a lot of disinformation out there. We all rely on media systems to get our information about what's happening in the larger world. And we should, right? I mean, it's not as if my pay and rent from where I sit are indicative of every other person in the world. I need to not just base my judgment on the economy on my perhaps completely non representative personal experience. I need more information. I get that from the media, but it turns out the media are partisan and biased and exaggerating these data in order to affirm the identity of the people who are watching them, to keep us hooked, to capture our attention. And the result is this sharp partisan bias. But today, I want to look at this from a different direction. And I'm going to start right with the economic data that if you were just an economist, I think you would focus on. And I got a lot of it on the board. I'm going to tick it through very quickly, right? Inflation is back down almost to where um, economists want it to be. The Fed Reserve wants it to be. And by the way, there's this controversy in economics about whether 2% is too low a target for inflation. If it is, then 2.5% really is excellent, but at least it's moving in the right direction. It's out of the extreme territory that it was in until recently. Overall economic growth, we would rather see it at 4%, I think, if you're a traditional economist, but that's about as high as it's been in the 21st century. We are in a period of lower economic growth in ways that I want to speak with you about in classes to come. It seems to me that that's largely accounted for by the fact that we're in a high inequality economy. And in a high inequality economy, the majority of the people are left out of the majority of wealth and income creation, and they don't therefore have as much to spend. And our economic growth is driven by consumer spending. It doesn't get much better than 3% in the 21st century. If we want it to go up to 4%, we have to do something to equalize our incomes and wealth. That's where we're going. But having said that, that involves being able to legislate. And we're back to that self reinforcing loop where discontent with the economy makes it hard to do anything about the root economic problems. So unemployment is low. The Fed target again is 4%. We're at 4.1. It's hard to get much closer than that. The US has added 7 million more jobs than it had before the pandemic, right? So we've added tens of millions of jobs under Joe Biden's presidency. A lot of those jobs were jobs that were lost to the pandemic. And in a sense, that's just recovering from the pandemic. The US did that more quickly and better than practically any economy in the world. And Biden and the Democrats and the Fed Reserve and the policies that were passed, and Donald Trump and the effort to get the COVID vaccine developed very quickly all get credit for that. But having said that, after you recover from the dramatic downturn in jobs caused by the pandemic, 7 million additional jobs, a deep sign of economic health for the economy measured as a whole. The stock market, as you probably have noticed, hitting all-time highs. Many Americans are getting big pay raises, and middle class wealth has surged, right? It surged to, on some accounts, record levels. I'll get into the details in just a moment. The Federal Reserve has begun to cut interest rates, and those interest rates are slowly percolating out into the economy. Mortgage rates are coming down a little bit. Hopefully, credit card rates will begin to come down as well. And the result may be that people will be a little bit less pinched in 2025 than they have been for the last 3 or 4 years. Um, The median American household has a net worth of nearly $200,000. And median versus average, I think these are different ways of trying to get a figure that is in the middle, right? And the median literally is the middle, right? 50% above, 50% below. The issue here, and we'll get into this, is that below the median, there's a sharp dive downwards. But still, that's not a bad number for the median income, and I'm sorry, median net worth, and it has gone up. And the median American household has $8,000 in savings readily available to it. You add then that, kind of similar to this, 54% of adults have cash on hand sufficient to cover 3 months worth of expenses if necessary, right? And so don't have to go into debt as soon as there's an emergency. Please note that the 46% who don't, the average savings for them is $400. And so that, like I've said before, they're one flat tire away from having to go into credit card debt or borrow money from somebody else or forego. And then is it meals? Is it clothes? Is it medical expenses? Now, 75% of people say that the economy is fair or poor. How do you reconcile, right, that last idea with everything I've just said to you? The economy seems so strong, but we as a society, and I'm going to get into consumer sentiment in just a moment, are not feeling it. And my suggestion is that part of the problem is that these data points, these, right, methods of measuring the economy, we call them indicators, right, are indicating things about the macro economy, the overall economy, but not sufficiently sensitive to how that translates into the lived experience of average people. And if we want to get a sense of what's happening with the average experience of people, I want to start by juxtaposing these two diagrams, and then I'm going to go further. Inflation, in the way that it is standardly measured by the Federal Reserve or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, subtracts food and energy, right? And the reason that it does that is because there's a lot of volatility in food and energy. They swing up and down, and they swing up and down for reasons perhaps unrelated to the kind of inflation that bankers and investors are most concerned about. The capitalist producers, even people who earn wages and engaged in wage negotiation, are most concerned about. They're interested in long-term stable or secular trends in prices, and if food and gas are so volatile, pull them out so that they don't give us the impression that we're moving in a direction that's different than the direction we're really moving in, or exaggerate our understanding of how quickly we're moving. Having said all that, I think it's quite obvious, right, that food and energy are two of the main things that people actually spend their disposable income on month by month. And so if we look at the rate of inflation just in food and fuel prices, and Bloomberg put together what they called an insult inflation index, adding insult to injury, or in particular being insulted by the idea that economists are telling you inflation is 9%, right? That was the peak rate. If you look down here in 2022, when the fuel plus food inflation rate is 40%, right? It is the second worst bout of inflation in regards to the ordinary expenses people pay most attention to in the last 60 plus years. And I want to start then by thinking about the potato eaters, right? They're the people buying potatoes, buying eggs, buying milk, buying hamburger, filling their gas tank, and they're being told, first of all, that inflation never really was that terrible, and second of all, it's now back under control. And they're saying, wait a sec, it may be under control as an economic problem, but as a personal budgetary problem, eggs still cost almost as much as they cost right up here. There's been a little bit of bringing the prices back down, but mainly the prices have stayed where they were. When inflation goes down to 2.5%, that means prices are not rising quickly anymore, but not that they're coming down. They're still actually increasing. And so, right, insult meaning you're telling me one thing, but I'm experiencing something else. And then we add to that, right, that what this does to ordinary Americans' ability to trust economic data, experts, mainstream press, mainstream politicians who tell them, look, the worst of this is over. Things are coming back under control. You want to stay the course. We're returning to normal in the aftermath of the pandemic. And they're saying, you guys don't know what you're talking about, right? You call yourself experts, but clearly you're not sensitive to the increase in the price of eggs in the way that somebody who doesn't have your fancy degree and your high income is. And so I do want to begin drilling down on this question and to then spend a little bit more time thinking about the idea that inflation of the last 3 years, right? And we've looked at this together already. The idea that wage growth exceeded, I'm sorry, inflation exceeded wage growth for 3 out of the 4 years of Joe Biden's presidency, right? Um, that occurred in a context. And the context in which it occurred in was one of a slow mounting affordability crisis. And I've shown you this diagram before. This diagram does not take into account, I wish I could find an updated version of this, what happened in the 3 years of inflation during the pandemic, but it does show you from 1998 to 2018. And I want you to look in particular at 4 categories of expenses here, and I believe they're all captured. Housing expenses, right? Where in this period, which was a low inflation period, there was 40% inflation in housing. And I want to explain for a moment, right? 12 million Americans roughly are what we call housing burden. They're spending more than 30% of their income on rent or mortgages. A substantial portion of those people are spending more than 50%. Then two other categories we've talked about: healthcare and childcare, right? And please note that the inflation there has been 120% over those years. And then, right, hospital services way up over 200%. Education, higher education in particular, expenses up around 175%, right? And so you put those things together and you have a slow developing affordability crisis only because, right, food and beverages have not been rising as much. Cars, household furnishing, clothing, right, everything in blue has been 0% for 20 years or less, right? TVs, they're, right, costing, 90% less than they cost in 1998. It's quite phenomenal what has happened with toys, computers, cell phone service, clothing, household furnishings, all driven down by globalization, right? And so I'm going to suggest that two things have been allowing Americans to manage this mixed picture with regards to affordability, with some core essential goods. Housing, right? You have to have it. Healthcare, you have to have it. If you are having children and want to participate in the economy, you have to have childcare, right? And same thing with healthcare. When you have a health issue, you have to use medical services. You really don't have any choice about it, right? And so two things that have been happening to allow for people to cope with these core costs increasing gradually, but ultimately at a rate that is unsustainable. One of them I'm going to refer to as adaptive preferences. And in a sense, this is the potato eaters, right? You use whatever you can afford. And for a while, you put the best face on it. You still dress up, you still treat it like it's a proper meal, even though all you can afford to eat or all that's available to eat is potatoes that night, right? And so with regards to housing, right? People who are living in too little square footage. I live in the New York City environs. I see this all around me, right? You know, three, four people in a one bedroom apartment. They make it work, right? People sleep in the living room if there's a living room, in the dining room kitchen if that's the way the apartment is configured. There's also a day bed, right? And you move further away from where your job is. You get a job offer in an expensive city. You really want to take it, but you don't take it because you can't afford to move there when you do the search for the housing. We tried to hire someone a few years ago who really wanted to come teach at Sarah Lawrence, but we couldn't get her to come because the cost of living is too high. She did the calculation. And so, right, people have been adapting themselves to the way in which increased expenses on housing, on healthcare, on childcare, on education impact them. And slowly over time, you can do this, and perhaps that keeps it from being registered in some of those big data. You're still spending less on rent, right? But that's because you're living three or four people in a space that's supposed to have two people maximum, or because you didn't take that job that you wanted to take because you couldn't afford to move there, right? And so in a sense, people adapting to these increased costs has been camouflaged the way in which these increased costs are impacting people. But that can only be sustained for so long. To go back to Van Gogh, you can only eat potatoes for so long and be all right, either nutritionally or in terms of your satisfaction with your diet, right? And then you add what I'm going to call compensatory consumption, right? And this is the idea. Look, I can't take that job I really wanted to take. I really wish I had enough space for my children to live with me. I really wish I could get married, but I can't move out of my parental home right now because my partner and I can't afford to rent a new apartment. Or, my childcare expenses are so high, I'm not going to be able to take a vacation or see my parents this year, right? Those trade offs make you unhappy. Well, what if I could get a new car for a lot less money, or even better, a new flat screen TV, right? And so for a long time, I want to suggest also that this was not driving down people's perception of their economic well-being, in part because there were at least some things that were staying more affordable. And that what the pandemic did, and especially the high inflation of the pandemic did, was drive the costs of all of these goods up in ways that is reflected in these diagrams, right? Unfortunately, not in this diagram. I wish we could extend it out. Um, and made people start focusing a little bit more. Wait a sec. Now that the stuff that used to be cheap is also much more expensive, how in the world can I afford to live, to make ends meet, to save, to eventually buy a house or eventually move out of that one bedroom apartment. And I think it really has made what was a slow simmering affordability crisis much more salient, much more obvious to many people. And so this is consumer sentiment. And it's not a great diagram. I'm using the one that the Federal Reserve with the University of Michigan puts out, and as you can see, right, for a long period in the last 20 years of the 20th century, consumer sentiment on average was close to 100. It got really driven down, obviously, in 2008. It started to come back up until the pandemic hit. But if you look, right, obviously the pandemic drove it down to near all-time record lows. But when it came back, it didn't come back in the way that it has in the past. And in fact, it's moved back down. And I want to offer the explanation that the reason people are so sour about the economy, the reason that although the economy seems to be doing much better, it could be consumer sentiment lags and that it'll catch up eventually. I think that more likely it's that the affordability crisis is made more obvious now than it has been in the past, and that the economy getting better is not going to solve these problems. It's not going to solve the fundamental inequality problem that the benefits are going primarily to the top. But even if we do have a period of broad based economic growth, it would have to be remarkable growth to allow wages to catch back up to all of the inflation in these core sectors of what we consume. And I just don't see that happening. So, with all of that in mind, then I come back to Karly Polanyi and I remind you that Polanyi points us to land, labor, and money as artificial economies. I'm sorry, artificial commodities. If we just let the economy handle these goods, treat them as if they're just like cups or glasses or widgets, as we say, right, then people are not going to have to take land for a second, affordable housing, because the market doesn't have an incentive to produce affordable housing, especially in conditions of economic inequality, where much more profit can be made off of making luxury housing. This is a problem that we can only solve by partially decommodifying land and labor and money. And that the problem we have in the United States is we have lost the capacity to implement public policy that brings the cost of healthcare, of housing, of higher education down. And the result is, right, especially in the aftermath of a bout of sustained inflation, that more and more people are focused on the affordability crisis and what it's doing to us. I think maybe rather than moving into new ideas, and I have promised you I'm going to do a debate between Karly Polanyi and Milton Friedman. That's where, assuming there aren't big news things, will start next week. But I did want to give that more 2024 perspective, why Polanyi helps us to see some of the problems we have and why it is that despite a lot of good economic news, it's not translating into goodwill on the part of the American people for the incumbent or for the current policy regime. And I'll say just one more thing about this briefly, and that is that it seems to me that part of the problem here, right? We need public policy. And by the way, Kamala Harris has an 82-page public policy, economic policy plan that if you read through it, I think it's obviously superior to what Donald Trump is offering. It obviously, in particular, really tries to go after the issues to do with the affordability of housing. I've spoken with you about this in the past. If you look at the ratio of housing costs, buying a house to income, it's now 6 to 1. That's the worst it's ever been since we've started collecting this data, right? And so we have a crisis. Harris has a plan for addressing this crisis. It's not, I think, a perfect plan, but at least it's a plan. I don't think Trump really has a plan. Why wouldn't the American people just be voting in large majorities for the person with a plan to address the problem that is, I'm suggesting to you, the fundamental problem in economics in the 21st century? And the answer, I think, in part is we have no confidence that Harris can actually pass that plan. And that's not just because it seems like it's highly unlikely that the Democrats are going to control the Senate. Yes, that obviously prevents her from passing that plan. It's also because, frankly, Obama, right, had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate and a large majority in the House. And yes, he got Obamacare passed, and yes, that's done a little bit to confine healthcare costs. I'm going to go back to the diagrams for a second and see if you see this or not. I'm not sure how it will show up in the diagram I have, but some of not it really doesn't show up. Some of the medical care inflation has come uh, down since Obamacare has been passed. But having said that, it's still hard to bear. And to come back to the core idea, Obama didn't do anything about affordable housing, right? He didn't do anything to increase the equality of the distribution of income and wealth in our society. He didn't do anything about the affordability of higher education, right? Joe Biden has been president for 4 years. For 4 years, he's been trying, for instance, to reduce higher education debt to give students some, or former students, some debt relief, and he keeps failing. We have a political system where it's really hard to legislate when you've got partisan parity and hyperpartisanship. The two parties basically control half of Congress each, and they really don't like each other, especially the Republicans see in any way working with the Democrats as a betrayal. And so I don't want to say an average voter is misled or incomprehensible if Harris has a plan and Trump doesn't. But Harris's plan has no more chance of passing than Trump's ideas, right? Then what good is that plan? So again, the politics and economics in our country are feeding each other. Our economy is undermining our democracy. Our democracy is so impaired that it can't solve our economic problems. And that is leading to populism. That's leading to frustration. That's leading to a desire to have somebody to blame and scapegoat. And I hate to say it, but that may very well determine the outcome of the election we're witnessing in the next couple weeks. I will stop there for today. I've got plenty more to say about this. We'll be back together next week. Assuming nothing big pops up, that's where we'll pick up next week. But for today, questions, thoughts, comments, disagreements, who wants to start us out? You're also happy to be able to get out of your apartments. You're like, I think I'll give it a rest today. David, go ahead. I can see you've got your hand up. You're outside again, aren't you?
I am.
Looks like a
Oh,
nice day there.
it is a lovely day. Uh, what I wanted to say was that I heard, I guess it was David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart last night talking about things. And what Brooks pointed out was that it's been a long time, I guess the first 2 years of Obama, since anyone had a real sort of hold on the White House and Congress,
Mm-hmm.
and that a stable majority has been elusive for a long time. And I think what that does is it puts us in a position where uh, instead of voting for the person who can solve the problem, since we're about 50-50 and we have parity between the parties, we end up voting for the person who will uh, hold the fort against complete disaster.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to hope for a period in which you had the houses, the parts of government lined up so that you could really push legislation in whichever way you wanted to put it, but push it. And I think that is what a lot of us are doing. Is we're trying to hold the line, keep things from getting any worse than they are.
Yeah,
Just to come, yeah.
I agree. I read Brooks' column from 2 days ago, which was titled, at least in the version I read it, "Why Isn't She Running Away with This?" Right? And the argument he made was in part that partisan identity has become so fixed in the 21st century that it's almost akin to religious identity, and that churches, generally speaking, concentrate much more on catering to their flock than they do on proselytizing, right? And so Harris and Trump are trying to mobilize their base much more than they're trying to reach out to undecided voters. And I do have to say that I don't entirely agree with Brooks' reading of even what Harris and Trump are doing. Harris is trying really hard to showcase the traditional Republicans who've endorsed her, to indicate to Republicans out there who are dissatisfied with Trump that she is a satisfactory alternative. She has, to my mind, moved probably too aggressively to the center, but she's trying to win moderate or undecided voters. Now, having said all that, the idea that our partisanship is negative, it's based on dislike or fear or anger or dehumanization of the other side, right? And that in a sense, that um, emotional space is not a space of hope, right?
Yeah,
It's,
and one way it's captured is that
did we lose David mid thought? Oh no. Well, we'll have to see if he comes back. But I was going to say one more thing. right? Which is what I'm trying to do in today's class in this series is to say, where does this come from, right? It's not the case that saying we're
Uh,
mobilized by negative partisanship just causes this, right? Why are we
yeah.
motivated by negative partisanship? And there I want to suggest that the idea that economic prosperity is receding quickly in front of our eyes may account for why we're fearful and angry and aggrieved rather than hopeful or constructive or looking for solutions in the 21st century. I think, David, are you back? No, I thought I was hearing his voice for a moment. I don't know. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? He might have lost his battery. It looked like he was on his phone. There he is. David, you were mid thought when you went away. Do you want to complete
Well,
it?
a phone call came in and disrupted me. But what I was going to say is that 50 years ago, uh, if you were worried about your son and daughter's future and who they were going to marry, you might base that on some ethnic lines or maybe on some religious lines, but probably you didn't worry too much if you're a Democratic family and your daughter or son was going to marry a Republican. But I think your notion of it's just like religion is right now because I think that people worry about whether their son or daughter will marry a Democrat or a Republican. And maybe the only solution I see is that if independents formed some kind of party where they could force either the Republicans or Democrats to take them more into account as a political force, we might actually be able to regain stable majorities the way that uh, European social democracies do with coalition governments. I don't know that the two party system is serving the interests of democracy very well at this point.
I would just note very quickly our electoral system produces a two-party system, right? We would have to change the whole way we organize congressional elections, which I think we should do. Don't get me wrong. But in a sense, there's a prior step. Independents are disregarded in American politics because they almost never win. At best, they're spoilers, but even that is rare. I'll say very quickly, because I hear you searching for solutions to the partisan gridlock in American politics. Two things. The first is I'm with you and I'm thinking along the same lines, and I do think that part of what's going to happen in a couple weeks is that one or the other party is going to suffer a terrible identity crisis, right? I think is more obvious with the Republicans and Trump because they're so committed to this man and he's come to define their party. But please note, if the Democrats lose to Trump, they're also going to have to do a serious self-examination and figure out what could we do better to prevent this terrible thing from happening again. So that's one thing I'm thinking about. The second thing I would say is, look, if Donald Trump wins the presidency, and assuming that he means half of what he says when he campaigns, assuming that he ultimately does bring into his administration all the people who've been so active in creating Project 2025, assuming, as a title to a previous talk I've given to you guys, that our institutions can't save us from our politics in 2025, that the Supreme Court is left all the guardrails off the highway, right? We may need to be thinking about how we resist. And it's going to be a different game from what it was in 2017. And as much as I want to think about how we make the Democratic Party or maybe the Republican Party a better vehicle for solving these problems or American politics work better, I think the other question is going to be, how do we keep a potentially authoritarian president from going after his political enemies, from going after immigrants who are married to citizens, from doing incredibly destructive and cruel things. And how do we do so while staying safe ourselves in a climate of incredible political mistrust and animosity, in which perhaps some of the previous guarantees of safety are no longer to be taken for granted. And so I'm not all the way there yet, but that's one of the things I think we need to spend some of our political imagination and energy thinking through as well. I think that's a place to leave off for today. That's kind of a promissory note for a future conversation. With a bit of luck, maybe it's a conversation that becomes less urgent a couple weeks from now. But I do think we cannot count on that. Flossie, are you raising your hand? Looks like it. Got to unmute yourself. You're still muted. Okay, you're just saying so long. Okay, right back at you, and be well, guys. Glad you're doing better. Um, Difficult times, nervous times. Hang in there, stay calm, figure out ways to turn your nervous energy into constructive energy, and be well. I'll see you next week. Bye bye, everybody. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you.